Good afternoon, John Haver. We are back starting off our week with a CPF webinar. I always have something to add. So John, on our Facebook feed, I can see your participants window, just FYI. So right now, we'd really like to encourage everyone, if you want to post in the chat where you're calling in from, so we can all say hi again. It's been a wonderful 3-day weekend, and we are ready to get back to work here at CPF. We encourage you to visit our website. We just announced our Preservation Design Awards winners for 2022, and there's a couple of fun surprises there. You're going to want to check it out. And also, please donate and consider joining CPF. We have a ton of great programs coming up the rest of this year, and we're already planning the annual conference for in-person at Fort Mason in April. So you're not going to want to miss any of these things. So I would like to welcome our speaker today, Roderick and James. Welcome to CPF webinar. Thank you very much for your time and everything. And so if anyone also wants to start posting in the Q&A, John loves it when people post questions the whole hour, and we'll get to those at the end. So you two, take it away.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having us and allowing us this time to show our work and to kind of consider our work in the context of modernism and the history, the legacy of that history in our environment, but also in our work in particular. So with that.
Technology hopefully is working, looks like it. So
we're starting with a little bit of an introduction to ourselves. We're actually, this talk is being held at our office. So we're at Pier 33 in San Francisco. So you're seeing one of the rooms in our space. We're right on the bay. The port is our landlord. And so we thought we would start by talking a little bit about our backgrounds and its influence on the work that we do. What you're seeing on the left is John Cage working on prepared piano music. I studied architecture. I studied music before I studied landscape architecture. And so some of my relationship to ideas about modernism and history of the 20th century art is connected to that history with music. And on the right, James.
Yeah, and part of that early connections was when I had the fortunate thing of having an undergraduate architecture degree from USC and having Pierre Koenig as one of my professors. So the case study homes, and that was very much part of the language of what we were trained in.
So what you're seeing here is the connection of John Cage's prepared piano music with gamelan music, the idea of rethinking the instrument and the inspiration was thinking about a gamelan orchestra, Indonesian music, gong music, and transforming the piano to kind of reflect some of the sort of timbre, but also some of the kind of organizational, compositional elements within the music. And then sort of beyond that is a very specific history with people rethinking even instruments themselves. And so what you're seeing is a photograph of Harry Parch, and other kind of originally Californian, I would say maybe not totally proto-modernist, but someone that was engaged in rethinking both instrumentation, but also even rethinking ideas about tonality. And so what you're seeing on the right is a just intonation graph, which probably I don't know that I'm even qualified to talk about at length at this moment, but part of the legacy that I think informs some of our music. You're seeing actually some of the instruments that Harry Parch built. On the left and on the right is a project that we recently completed at the Bay Area Discovery Museum, which is this very sort of playful slide. And I don't think there's a direct influence, but something that certainly is part of the vocabulary that's part of our history.
And then part of my history is I had the fortunate opportunity to spend a significant amount of time with my inspiration, which is Roberto Burle Marx. This is one of his projects in Brazil. He was a master at many a thing, including opera singing to landscape architecture, and transform some of the larger urban design moves that we recognize for Rio de Janeiro. But what's interesting about him was the materiality. He would literally go out into the forest and discover plants, and then bring them back, and then think of them in a modern way to explore space and form and complement the architecture that was currently happening at the time. This a little note to him he wrote me. So it was really a magical time to spend with him at his house and his gardens, understanding the process that he brought to design and abstractions. And this led into one of the early projects we did in Hawaii. This is the Onaha Tower. And there's a bunch of drama, just like Roberto would love, like our friend here swimming off the edge of the building. But the plan itself is really an abstraction of what was here before, the coral beds, which make up the forms around the pool, and then the waves that would have crashed on the shore here, and these earth forms that they're then planted with palms, and literally having a series of gardens and sense of play. And that, yes, that is a beach volleyball course 7 stories up in the air. So really the sense of play, fun, discovery, but the overall narrative happening. And I think that comes to this image here, which is, this is Sutro Tower. My father was actually the designer of the Sutro Tower. And so being a landmark in California, you have a lot to live up to. And part of that was an interesting way of thinking about not only the physical form, but the sort of motions and wavelengths that emanate to and from it. So thinking about sort of the ephemeral at the same time as the structural. And as you can see here in my parents' garden to the left, that influence of being a structural seismic engineer also brought into the family home. So I designed this garden here that really talks about the shifting plates in California and the cracks that appear, and then the kinds of plantings that could grow in those cracks that are low water use. So it's literally converting my parents' garden into something that illustrates that beauty does not have to come with lawn.
So another part of our practice is teaching. I mean, we teach, we're not necessarily focused on scholarship to a great degree, but it is, we try to sort of bring our experience as practitioners to our teaching. This is the first page of a syllabus that we created for a studio that we taught in Joshua Tree, which describes that phenomenon that I think probably many of us are familiar with in the desert, in which water creates these incredible sort of displays of color in the desert. Currently, and so there's a few slides of us traveling in Joshua Tree with our students. And currently we're teaching a studio, and then actually this is a project that Kazina, who was in our studio and now works with us, did for that studio. Right now we've embarked on a new studio in Iceland, and we're about to take the students there in about 2 weeks time.
But I think what's important about what we're trying to do through our teaching is to understand these very strong and powerful landscapes, whether it's Iceland or Joshua Tree, to understand that these strong landscapes actually have very fragile ecologies. And how do you insert or layer in design within these sort of bigger environments, but also to learn, because obviously as with sweltering hot here today, climate change is a real thing. So through understanding how plants and animals survive in these kinds of extreme environments, they'll hopefully give insight for both the students and ourselves about how to engage landscape with our ever-changing world.
So one of the, I think one of the legacies of modernism in landscape architecture and in gardens is the idea of sort of material authenticity and then in some ways rethinking the use of materials in projects. I think it has a very different history than in architecture, but something that's kind of adjacent and in parallel with it, but oftentimes a little bit hard to exactly put one's fingers on, as opposed to the kind of European modernist history within architecture that spread to North America and South America. So one of the projects that we worked on that's in San Francisco, it's a public project along the water, is this Barnacle Project, which is more or less kind of a seating plaza project. And it really was using technology to create these gigantic abstract barnacles as a way of creating a space here, but also kind of testing the capacity of materials.
But I think it was also testing what you could do in a public space. When we engage with this project, what you are looking at is quote unquote historic asphalt. And so the kind of limitations that different agencies put on you really make you think creatively on how to do it. So, what's underneath this crazy historic asphalt that we can't touch, or the barnacles on the piers below. So really that expression of bringing and making them big and enormous and engaging for the public on the top was a different way of thinking about what is actually going on in the site.
This is another project in San Francisco in which we wanted to express the kind of geologic history of the site. So what you're seeing are these, this is on 3rd Street. It's Pierpont Lane, so it's a public space adjacent to the new Uber buildings. We really wanted to kind of create a little bit of a wilder, less sort of manicured open space. And so in line with that was the idea of incorporating some of these really large scale stone pieces and manipulating them.
And I think that manipulation also transformed this piece here, which is the water feature at Expedia, just using allowing gravity itself to just allow the flow of water over a surface, and then actually abstracting the surface. In this case, we literally mapped the sound, the Seattle sound, the surface of the sound and the rippled waves, and then put it in the computer, and then CNC routed those forms to, in essence, recreate that texture so that when the water moved over, when you're entering this project, even before you see the sound, you get an experience what it's like to be on the sound, the way the light hits the water, but also the way the sound engages your senses, so that it's a transformative already from the beginning. And that went to this project here as well, where, you know, not everything you have a lot of money, and this was a inexpensive stone. We then challenged ourselves, well, how can you make this relatively inexpensive material chic? And so by changing the textures and the surfaces of it, we're able to get this wonderful patterning that really reflects some of the modern moves of the Ossipof building. And that goes to this one. This is Vladimir Ossipof, and this is the IBM building that he created in 1963. As you can see, it was a very complex one. In Honolulu, thank you, Roderick. Yeah, in Honolulu. So we've jumped over the Pacific here. But what's interesting about this is it was slated to be torn down. And not to say that we had any single hand in it. Lots of people have been uproar about this, but we did see the merit of what was going on. As you can see, the plinth there around the base. Really what we were charged with was to get ADA access around the base of this building and have a drop off for limos, because they're now using this building as a sales center to promote different towers that are going up in the neighborhood. But you can see the form, and it was quite beautiful, and the connection to the sort of the basket weaving of the indigenous descendants. But they're also calculated so that there was no spot where a pigeon could stand roost. But it is really this iconic element that we then picked up on. And then can you transform or highlight within the landscape? When we arrived, it was a death by asphalt parking lot. But there's also many stories to be told. And that's part of this. This is the end product. You can see how you now have a flush condition. And this is the first sort of urban plaza within Honolulu itself. It's organized by that water feature you saw on the side. And that water feature is really telling the story of the native descendants. And that's how they have their creation story, where they have Sky Father and Earth Mother came together and they created taro, which is that plant that you see there. And it was, quote, stillborn. And so their second child was man, who was created to take care of the taro. So the water feature itself then becomes this sort of merging of the storytelling, but it started with the way that you read everything in Hawaii. You're always brought to the horizon line, because the interface between sky and water when you're on an island, it becomes very important. And so this is what it was like when we came, this death by asphalt parking lot, as I said. But the ocean, as you can see back there, after the parking lot, there's a 4-lane highway, and then there's a parking lot and a water. So we thought we'd bring the shoreline, the horizon, to the front. And so to screen out all that, and then to create this water feature that then told the story about the descendants and how this would come together of the Sky Father through the reflections of the water patterns on the leaves of the plants, and then Earth Mother supporting the plants, and then you as a descendant are the last component of the piece. So you can see the before and afters here with that. Again, the sound creates a white noise that completely takes out the sound of the 4-lane highway on the other side. But sometimes you design things, you really don't know what's going to happen. And this was the pleasant surprise. Again, we just thought it was going to be a drop off, but people took it over. So you'll show up, there'll be movie nights, yoga, the Biennale is taking over the space. You can see Kusima and Chen. And then the descendants themselves, it's a perfect opportunity to tent over and create performance spaces and market spaces, and even a ice skating rink. But again, this idea that you're connecting both the architecture and the landscape, but also the ephemeral quality of this water feature registers the ever-changing world around you, so the sunsets, the wind patterns, the storms, everything, the reflections within the surface of the water really connect one to the environment they're sitting around. And I think that goes towards our next project, which is a residence. And you can start to see how the Hawaiian modernism is layered in here into this project, Ala Scarpa. This entrance piece here is telling the story of the Naupaka flower, which is a really interesting story about two lovers. So every time the gate opens and closes, the lovers are getting reunited. This is a rethinking. You do not have to have a driveway that is all solid. And then these sort of moments as you pulled through this sort of solid wall and then out to the landscape with the frame to the moats. And then these series of gardens that you're moving through, again, the kind of lushness and character and the ability to work with tropical plants is always a great thing for a landscape architect. As you sort of move through that space, you enter into the tide pool. And so the pool is a function of, it's not on the beach because it's the wind and everything is quite strong. So we wanted to create this oasis behind. So literally you step down into the pool from all sides. The two edge sides are planted with the taro and with water lilies. So you get this blurring between what is green and fish focused and then what you swim in. So you start to see the sound of water in those cascades, again, connecting it to the taro fields, which are adjacent. Here's the pool and the lanai. This idea that literally we're bringing the beach or the ocean to within the property. So you see these connections and feel that you're not missing out because it's too windy outside on the beach. Again, these sort of connections here of how these slipping panels of stone work together to create this sort of movement around. That's the shifting and that you can see what's water plant and what's pool changes as it moves around there. And little points to hang out in. You can just go quicker through this because obviously we appreciate this project, but it's like, even it's transformative day and night. This character being able to sit out there and look at it. And this is the story which I think we like to investigate as well. It started off as the idea of the Naupaka flower, which is, again, these two lovers that were separated by the goddess Pele and eventually actually killed by them. But the idea that this flower can be found on the beach and it can also be found in the mountains. So when you put them together, it completes the blossom. So we started from the mock-up of just twisting papers to doing clay models and then doing casting, as you can see inserted in the wall.
So back to some of the themes I think we are very interested in our projects is this transformation of materials. This is a garden in San Francisco. The client was very excited about using stone in this project. There's a pretty significantly tall wall because it's in San Francisco and we needed to retain quite a bit of the site. So the sort of foundation of the project is this wall that becomes kind of a sculptural element. It becomes a place for lighting. Obviously, it becomes a climbing wall as well. And it defines the space as kind of an edge to the architecture. Here you're seeing sort of the original condition and how the wall kind of transformed what we arrived to. And you can see this sort of playful connection to light in the sculpture of the wall. This is another project in in the Bay Area, actually in Ross, but I think is a bit connected also to the idea of a kind of modernist history. The architect are Stephen Ehrlich and Takashi Yanai. it's sits in a really interesting moment in the landscape. On the north side of the house is a redwood grove, and on the right side is oak savanna. So it's kind of these two landscapes that meet at the top of a hill. And so our approach from a landscape perspective was to kind of sort of exaggerate, emphasize, maybe make legible that very specific kind of condition. You can see in this photograph in the far background, you can see the bay. This is the sort of, pardon me, redwood fern grove, which, you know, is very distinct from the oak zone that you see at the entrance. Pardon me. This is the Uber campus and Pierpont Lane project. We touched on that at the beginning of the talk. The architects are shop architects based in New York. There's a kind of urban and public component to the project. This is 3rd Street. Our idea was really to kind of make sure that we were composing this Pierpont Lane public space as a series of openings, as differently scaled spaces that people can spend time in. We're inspired by things like Pina Bausch's dance theater projects, and thinking about how the composition of movement in those projects can inform a public space. And again, we were very excited about bringing a kind of wildness to the planting design. So much of these plants are native or low water use, Mediterranean adaptive plants. We love the idea that it's lush and a little bit unkept, and that it's immersive, that you feel distinctly somewhere else from the architecture, although there is a kind of compositional conversation that happens between the architecture and the landscape.
And functionally, what you're looking at now is a rain garden. So those things that people around various cities are trying to test on, the kind of idea that you're using green technologies to treat stormwater runoff before it enters into the larger system. And so this is one of those within Pierpont Lane. They really do not have to just be Juncus. There's lots of other plants that you can layer in.
And I think in some ways, this might be where we depart from this modernist tradition that we inherited or are engaged in. I think we have learned a lot from looking at gardens that people might characterize as kind of traditional gardens or classic gardens, really thinking about planting as a compositional element, as something that can kind of fuse, thinking about color and spatial ideas about the outdoor space. And so this is, I think, an example of that. We also were really interested in kind of bringing into the project this sense of the geology of San Francisco. So we sourced these really large scale stones that we showed at the beginning of the talk, and kind of created composition with these stones. But I think it was important to us that they don't appear as if they were always there. So what you see is actually that the stones are very manipulated. So some of them actually have kind of this sort of surface texture that's as it was found in the fields. Some of it's actually a little bit smoother, and then some of it's actually polished. So there is, I mean, maybe in a way inspired by Noguchi and thinking about his manipulation of the stone and his sculpture work, we're trying to make that kind of manipulation somewhat legible, not in a really didactic way, but still perhaps to inspire curiosity by people that are using the space.
But also that tactile quality of it. I think when we engage with these landscapes, we want you to touch them. We want the sensories to be overloaded with textures and forms but also the way they feel.
And then, one of the first projects our office worked on was not in California, but was in Monterrey, Mexico. It's the Museum of Steel. Nicholas Grimshaw is the architect. This is a view from the air. This is actually, it's a little bit hard to tell, but what exactly it is, because the graphic is so strong, but it's a roof planting.
This is the largest green roof in Latin America. It's completely planted with different sedums, so it's non-irrigated at the same time. So we're excited to see, because in Mexico, the professional landscape architecture doesn't really exist. So this is what it looked like when we came on the site. We collaborated with Claudia Harari from Monterrey, Mexico. And then we started working together to unearth the history of the place and then think about how to do something from afar. So we do these sketches, and then here's the roof you can see as well. We resisted trying to put trees and shrubs on here because we thought the architect had created a datum plane that you can see there, that you really read the larger landscape of the Sierra Nevadas beyond. So we wanted to keep that. And then the other, I always call this the best sustainable project, because they didn't know what landscape was. There was no budget for it. So literally everything we did, we had to reuse from the original plan. So what you're looking at now is the edge of the steel panels that used to form the edge of the hall that we turned into a 200-meter long water feature that reflects where the trains used to come in and out and offload the raw material, which you see there. In the mist, and the mist is actually you'd think it'd be hot rocks, but they're not actually hot. It's just low-tech sprinklers as a mist or cooling. So when visitors arrive at the Museum of Steel, you can see it. And those same materials then transformed in things that we dug up, these walls where the raw material had fused to it, and then juxtaposed to the final material and how it looks in the bridge structure beyond. So making these relationships. And here you can see that the mist working with the raw material, inviting this class of school kids. This is changing things around a little bit more. This is a project in Woodside, a residential project. These are 70, 150-year-old olive trees that we were able to save from destruction. And we layered this landscape together this is an Olsen Kundig home. So there's a part where you come through this sort of structured grove, and then you hit this water feature that we designed, which is an extension of the architecture itself, and these sort of secret gardens and elements that you discover as you come in from the front entrance. And as it reaches the far end, it enters into the access of water, turns into a meadow. And this meadow is started off with drawings like this. So they're larger hand gestures and then converted into plant palettes. What we work with specifically in this to make this a completely sort of non-irrigated and native meadow. So this is the scale and size. So we had that structured side to below to this unstructured side of meadow using natives, but also Mediterranean species that you would typically use low water use, with the center portion collecting the water that runs through this valley. And then you can see more lush plantings of juncus and different grasses. So this is what it looks like now after it's been planted in infrared. So we're really about, again, capturing light and minimizing water use and literally tying the existing landscape beyond to the new house. As you can see, as you move through this, this is a really great garden. The clients would talk about grabbing their wine and walking here during COVID and discovering new plants and new forms and new textures and different kinds of habitat for butterflies, bees, that were then incorporated into the piece with these sort of sculptural pieces like the agave you see here at this outdoor desk integrated in. and the sedum. And then looking back at the house, these series of pavilions and organized by the sort of horizontal pool edge that you're seeing here. That's the pool there. Then jumping around, this is a much larger scale project. This is in Auckland, New Zealand. We do quite a bit of work in New Zealand, and when we're asked to look at the entrance to the airport, it's also sort of the entrance to the country of New Zealand. So we had to really think about things in a different way. So we started to think about how people first engaged with New Zealand. The original Polynesian population that arrived in the big wakas landed literally right here at the airport. When they arrived, they had food stock to keep them alive, which was all from Polynesia, which is warm, but New Zealand is more like Portland and chilly. So because Auckland is made up of 90 volcanoes, they use the material, the stone, to create these large carved out zones in the landscape and then line them with the rocks so that during the day it would heat up, and at night the plants at the bottom could survive sort of the cold temperatures. But they created these wonderful sort of engagement of earth forms and using the indigenous rock to create these large forms. So they became these inspirations for us to create these large earth forms that in essence give you a big hug when you arrive, and then complemented with the Europeans that arrived in New Zealand, and they had their own sort of effect of transformation using hedgerows, and that's how they kept their orchards and vineyards in this environment. So this relationship of the two sort of ways that one has engaged with New Zealand create up this landscape. And then in a finer texture, we wanted to use sort of the shell and forms and native materials and this smaller things that become an abstract of a jet engine, because it is an airplane and you are driving probably 100K because you're late for your flight. You get these smaller forms to then register in almost a cinematic kind of way that sort of emulate the excitement of air travel and what you're going to. So literally changing people's perceptions of a country before you arrive.
And then a little bit boomeranging back to the Bay Area is another Olson Kundig collaboration, which is a residence in Tiburon. Again, there are several sort of formal aspects throughout the landscape, rooms that are in some ways inspired by the compositional strategy of the architecture. But then there's another layer, I think, that we're bringing to the project, which is thinking about how the planting might reinforce actually this sort of formality of the architecture and the more formal parts of the landscape. And then actually thinking a little bit about areas as a kind of more regionally approached strategy, something that speaks to a larger landscape, not just the domestic landscape. So some of our inspirations kind of are pretty far afield. This is some Kiefer painting that was, at least on some kind of formal level, very inspiring to us to think about in terms of creating this meadow component in the project. There are kind of lots of different rooms throughout the site. It's a 5-acre site. So they're kind of defined, I think, in a lot of ways by the microclimates that they're each in. This is a water feature we designed, which obviously is kind of bringing the eye towards San Francisco and towards the Bay. This is a project we recently completed in Seattle. It is the Expedia campus. It's a 40-acre site. So in some ways, a lot of what we did has to do with larger kind of infrastructure to the site, incorporating stormwater issues. There's also a very significant public component to the site right on the sound. We sort of started earlier with this slide of how we composed the water feature and the surface there, but you can see it kind of extends these views to the city. And obviously there's a conversation that happens with the architecture here. But much of the project within 40 acres is a kind of more, I'll say, sort of pastoral landscape. There are courtyards that really aren't about formal kind of compositional strategies, but a little bit more about biophilia, like bringing people that are working here out into a bigger landscape that certainly speaks to the Seattle or Northwest landscape. These are two different courtyards with two different sort of strategies. Now you can see the view directly towards the sound, large kind of lawn zone for cricket. So that's was something that the clients needed for their employees. This is a really interesting site. It's all kind of landfill and old industrial fragments. So much of what we did was look at soil, but you can see some of its old industrial transportation history. There's a train tracks on one side and you know, all this kind of maritime activity on the other. And we created this beach that extends from inside of the campus to the outside. So this is all the public space that's directly on the sound, which was previously kind of a treacherous, like, I guess, bike path, sort of, neglected essentially.
Yeah, and I think that was one of the big moves, as you can see a clip of it here. Literally previously you'd go right along the water's edge and do a 90-degree turn. So we were able to sort of aggregate the public land and interface into a public space that was really sort of wonderful, and created this stepped sort of element here that you can sit on and perch on and look back at Mount Rainier. There was a previous pier here, so in essence the gesture is talking about there. And as Roderick mentioned, we literally brought the beach up the shore and then brought it into the project. So this blurring of the line between public and private, and the inclusiveness of stormwater and salmon safe practices really made this hit a note, I think, for the city of Seattle and for our client.
And I think for the purposes of time, we'll just kind of go quickly. This is another residence in the Bay Area in Portola Valley. The client is from New Zealand, and so was very excited about kind of plant materials that aren't specifically from New Zealand, of course, but something that speaks to this kind of merging of plant material within a kind of native landscape. And then a project that we completed recently in Palm Springs that is, I think, has all the kind of elements of a Palm Springs domestic garden. There's this sort of privacy to it, a kind of insular looking inside component of it, but and working with, you know, desert palette in terms of the plant material.
And I think what was interesting about this spatially is we took this existing house and removed the front yard and blurred it with the backyard. So there's really not a formal entrance other than the little speakeasy entrance you see that runs through the hedge. But that hedge becomes the datum that you then read the larger landscape, but also the kind of activities and sense of fun that you would expect in Palm Springs.
And so the pool, which is obviously kind of a water feature, is something we, you know, pretty clearly speaks to the idea of an oasis in a place like Palm Springs, which is certainly, you know, part of the experience of being there. And we added a neon squirrel sort of for personal reasons for the client. But there's a whole kind of like these plants become a kind of family for the client, especially while he was living there during that kind of quarantine. And I think we are just about out of time, so we'll quickly just show a kind of other preservation related projects very, very quickly. This is Faust Winery in St. Helena, which is the old St. Clements Winery. A lot of what we do is, I think, quieter than some of what happens in the architecture sometimes, but is related to the larger kind of context. That's the historic building that is painted black now, but we kind of reshaped the spaces. We added and celebrated the trees that were there, and then.
And this is Buena Vista, which is the first one that we worked on. This is the oldest winery in California. It was taken over by flamboyant Frenchman who literally, when we arrived here, there was nothing but asphalt and no code requirements. So what we literally did was to think about how one could enter and re-enliven this space, and then talk about the history elements. This maze here, you find and discover little history bits about the winery, but it was really the idea here is that, how do you, respect and honor these kinds of significant historic structures with a landscape that sort of complements but is different from what you would have expect from here. And I think that really sort of goes to the way that we think about things in all our work, is that sense of surprise or wonderment. It has to be a component, whether you're working with different customs or places or materials, that we make you think. And I think that is sort of one of the signature moments, and that's why none of our projects looks alike.
And I think that's our time.
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, unfortunately, it's not out of privacy that I'm not going to answer that question, but it's really a pretty broad range. It depends on where you are and what you want to have happen. I mean, I worked on a project in Belvedere recently, and it was basically a planting design project, which I was kind of excited to do. It meant actually a little bit more of a relaxing construction process for me. And so that project, was not that high of a cost. But there are projects that are ground up that are pretty gigantic and monumental. And so we're talking about residential work.
So we always laugh that, landscape costs something.
Yeah.
And even if you put wood chips all over a project and it's giant, it could be in the millions.
Yes.
But also, we love challenges of when it comes to the budget. We just actually are completing a project for the city of Hayward, a 1 mile long park that's 60 feet wide, adjacent to another highway. And our budget was $7 a square foot. So literally, we hook or by crook went to the boneyards in the city of Hayward. We looked at reusing benches. We took concrete slabs from old parking lots and sliced them up to use it for paving. Used existing asphalt walks and reshaped them by just saw cutting them. So, there's a wide range, and I mean, I'm even flummoxed on how we were able to pull that one off.
But, some of the very elevated projects that we showed, the project in Tiburon and the project in Hawaii that are residences, I mean, cost millions of dollars. They just did. So, I mean, it would be insincere for me to suggest that they didn't. But, one can do projects for considerably less.
Yes, like $7 a square foot.
Yeah.
Well, how do your yards look? A lot of times people say they specialize in something, and then do you have to mow your own lawns? Is my question.
Well, we personally, we have 2 gardens, one in San Francisco and one in Napa. And we didn't include them in this show, although we've actually photographed them. And and it's too bad that we didn't include them because that would be the best way to answer the question. We don't have lawn in any of our gardens.
Yeah,
so
we're sort
not-
of lawn
Yeah,
phobic
we're
unless
not-
you're.
I know, I realized I shouldn't have said that. I was like, oh,
No,
they
it's
said they don't
okay.
even
I
do
mean-
lawns anymore.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, the funny thing is like when you meet a lot of landscape architects, their gardens are crappy.
Yeah, right, that's
One
what I was,
neglects
yeah.
them because they don't want to do anything with them. I have one favorite friend, her philosophy is like, she's just gonna throw some seed out and whatever takes
Yeah.
or survives is it, which is a lot of way gardeners think about it in an interesting way. The gardens are low water use and the maintenance is really low. And in fact, our San Francisco garden has no irrigation to it.
But that said, you know, we like the idea of having gardens and engaging in gardens, and they are sort of experiments for us. They are places where we can test out materials. They're very low budget. We'll just cycle back to the previous question, because yeah, we don't have the budget that some of our clients do, but also we are pretty experimental. We're open to things not necessarily performing and us learning about that through our own gardens.
Yeah, I'm not necessarily. I think we were the forms and everything, and the containment and the species that we selected is pretty, and they're all native, so they're pretty robust. And so having volunteers come into that is difficult, I think, for the volunteer, put it that way. But we actually, we're very excited if that does happen. You know, landscapes are dynamic things. And so if there's, you know, edges that get blurred or something like that with different species, then I actually really enjoy that when that happens.
But, you know, I mean, landscapes take maintenance. I mean, that's just what it is. You know, Central Park takes maintenance, a lot of maintenance. The High Line takes a lot of maintenance. Golden Gate Park takes a lot of maintenance. That's just a reality to keep some of these spaces, you know, what they should be is just a requirement. And I think it's confusing to think that they don't.
Well, it's the same thing with buildings. People build, you know, modernism, they'll do modern building and then, you know, like, you know, 20 years later, they say, oh, we forgot to maintain it. Yeah, you know, it's the same thing. People think it should always be that way. But speaking of maintenance, we did get a question from Winston who said, how do you take into account not just this ongoing maintenance, but also things like we started off with some climate change, other changing physical conditions like sun bleaching, air pollution, how they influence your designs over time. Do you rely on clients to raise potential maintenance concerns or use field investigations to anticipate external influences and additional approaches? And I have one more little thing to add to that. Do you account for like the way that the sun moves all year? Because I garden a lot and I'll plant something, it'll do great for like 3 or 4 months and then it gets burned up in the sun. So how do you do this like larger concept of the landscape design? What are the sort of holistic?
Well, I think
thinking of that?
the first thing, Winston and Chris, is listening. You have to listen to everything, and you have to listen to the client, obviously, but you also have to listen to the soil, to the environment that it's sitting in. You have to listen to the culture that is surrounding this. So there's these moments where before you start anything, you really have to perk your ears up and ask questions and listen to responses and understand what's going to be appropriate in the right space and all those kinds of moments. I mean, you know, some people, you know, they like that something that looks robust at one point of the year, just completely disappears at another. So it reveals a different things. It really does take that sort of expertise of understanding what the site wants and those needs, and to merge them together.
But so my response is yes, we take into account all of those things. That's kind of our job, basically, is to evaluate what's going to do best in what location. And it is our job to prepare our clients for things that are going to be fit within their criteria in terms of a commitment to maintenance. And so that's what we do. And that's what, but we, of course, things happen. Irrigation gets turned off and for no reason. And so suddenly things kind of fall apart. But at this point, we are giving advice about what we think people should commit to. In other words, I'll just say it, we're not working on golf courses. That's not something that we probably want to contribute to right now, for example. But outside of that, I think we can make a lot of things work and be very creative and flexible about what we're doing. But certainly we give a whole range of clients our advice based on all the criteria that you described, not just sun exposure, but things like water use and what is going to be resilient, and thinking about climate change, and even like where materials are being sourced. Can we be clever about that? I mean, that is the same probably description you hear from interior designers and architects and so forth. And I think it is our responsibility as professionals to kind of move it forward.
Because at some point, every water feature gets turned off.
Right.
And so if it doesn't look beautiful without water in it, then it defeats its purpose. And so that's some of the philosophy. If someone does ask us for a water feature or something like that, I'm just using that as one case, right? That it has to be multifunctional and function aesthetically, and function of reusing, water and all these kinds of elements in an interesting way, so that when it is turned off, it doesn't get turned into a planter.
Mm-hmm. So there's a little bit of a mix in what we presented today, but mostly we work with someone named Marion Brenner, who we've worked with for years and who is a friend and someone who has in some ways changed the way we look at our work and even influenced our work itself. She's someone that we just owe a tremendous debt to, and in fact have gone on garden tours in Belgium and northern France with. So
her and Bob and us.
So she is just an amazing photographer and an amazing person. And I mean, does justice is one way of saying it, or kind of transforms it into something else. Website is a great way, sdisf.com. I also think we have a book called Material Landscapes on Monticelli Press, which is a good resource to look at the work. And then I also think it's really, I encourage people, I'm assuming at least some people are in the Bay Area, and so some of the work you're able to visit. Land's End is one of the projects. Golden Gate Bridge Plaza is another one. Pierpont Lane in Mission Bay is another one. So there's a whole host of projects that that one can visit in person and see how they're doing.
All right, I think we're just about ready to wrap up, but just the last question, since you told us where to get in touch, what is on your dream list? What kind of projects are you looking forward to?
You should tell them about New Zealand.
Well, absolutely. So we're like mentioned earlier, we do a lot of work in New Zealand, and so we've been fortunate to work on the waterfronts there and stuff like that. But the one that's really exciting us right now is a steel plant. So there's only one steel factory in New Zealand, and it's from its start in the early 60s was quite radical in how to make steel. That time has passed, and now they're looking at how can you transform this plant to net zero. So we are actually trying to work with the owners of the plant and thinking about both through land planning and planting different kinds of modes of energy generation, whether it's from solar or wind, but also things like hydro, and how do we think about the byproducts that happen from a steel plant and how they can be transformed in innovative ways that can benefit the communities that are adjacent to it, but also to the bigger world. So getting a steel plant to net zero by 2030 is our biggest challenge right now. And so we're very excited about that.
That sounds great. I think we're ready to wrap up. Is that right, John? Great program. No, 6 events.
Nice. Great.
Thank
Thank
you
you, guys.
guys. Thank you all
All
to
right.
listen.
Bye.
Yeah.